Thank you very much. My interest in this issue started many years ago when I read an article in the Atlantic magazine by Atul Gawande, a doctor in Boston, about the impact of isolation and solitary confinement on the human mind, not just in this correctional setting, but prisoners of war. He referenced our former colleague, John McCain, and what he went through after 5 years of that type of treatment and what impact it had on him. And Dr. Gawande, who now works for the USAID, reminded us that the majority of prisoners will ultimately be released. If they're damaged in the process of serving time in prison, they'll take that damage out into the open society and others may suffer. So this has been a long time issue. It's been 12 years since the first hearing under my leadership occurred in this committee. I voiced concerns over reliance on solitary confinement, pleaded with the directors now and before you to do something about it. I'm going to reintroduce my legislation, Solitary Confinement Reform Act, to limit the use of the practice. Director Peters, the latest statistics show that despite the decrease in Bureau of Prisons' total population since you were sworn in as director in August of 2022, the percentage and total of number of individuals in restricted housing is actually higher than it was at that time. As of this month, approximately 7.9%, or 11,179 people, are currently being held in some form of restrictive housing, an increase of 0.6% since September 2022. Director Peters, you previously pointed to your contract with the National Institute of Justice when asked about your plans to address restrictive housing. What is the status of that study?
Thank you, Senator. So the study is underway. NIJ has issued the contract. The individuals studying our restrictive housing have actually been on site and are visiting facilities, looking at our policies, our practices, and interviewing employees. We're also not just waiting for the results of that report. We're beginning to implement restrictive housing reform. Currently, we have plans to approve a new policy that will actually reduce the amount of time an individual can be sanctioned to restrictive housing for disciplinary purposes. As I mentioned in my opening comments, we're adding additional resources to solve this problem. And in the short term, as you well know in your very own state, we shut down the Special Management Unit in quick order last year.
Here's my concern. Since my first hearing on this issue in 2012, there have been multiple reviews of BOP policy. The latest came out earlier this month when the GAO published a report I requested. According to their report, BOP has not fully implemented 54 of the 87 recommendations from 2 prior studies on improving restrictive housing practices. One of those studies from 2014 was conducted by an external consultant. It made 34 recommendations, only 16 have been fully implemented. And a 2016 evaluation completed by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration, which President Biden ordered the Attorney General to implement in 2022, made 53 recommendations and only 17 have been implemented. The time for studies is over. The death rate in our prisons is unacceptable. The damage to mental health is unacceptable. My question to you is, what steps can you commit to today to immediately reduce restrictive housing populations?
Thank you, Senator. I think there are a variety of things that we're doing today, including approving that policy that's been long-standing negotiated with our national union, and that will decrease the amount of time that individuals can actually be sanctioned to restrictive housing for disciplinary purposes. The data also reveals that many of the individuals that are in restrictive housing are in there many times at their own choice because they fear their ability to walk in general population. So we are working on creating cultures and environments that are more normal and humane, so those individuals actually feel comfortable in general population. And then, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're creating positions who will work in restrictive housing, and their sole responsibility will be working with those individuals who don't want to leave restrictive housing and help them transition into general population. We did this in the state of Oregon, and it was very successful, so we're looking forward to rolling that out this year. We're also looking at best practices across the country and around the globe to implement changes. As I shared with you the last time that we met, this last year has been filled with strategic planning for the department. We've rebooted our mission, our vision, our values, and many of the goals that we're working on will tie into restrictive housing, both a strong plan around restrictive housing reform and building morale and working on our recruitment and retention issues, which are at the core of many of the issues, as the Inspector General pointed out.
What percentage of people in restrictive housing have volunteered to be in that housing?
That number is almost 40%, and we are looking at the data as we get even closer into the data. It might even be higher than that because we have individuals that are categorized as PC status, which falls into that 40%, but also individuals that are on transition status, and those too could fit into that category.
Aside from that category and those that are incarcerated because of their danger to other prisoners and cellmates, I'd like to ask you, do you accept the premise that those who are put in restrictive housing involuntarily run the very real risk of serious mental illness or worse?
Senator, I would argue that everyone who is in restrictive housing has will suffer from some form of mental or physical damage. I think even those that are agreeing or wanting to be in restrictive housing need to be educated on the fact that that isn't where they belong and that we need to be able to safely house them in GP. Just because they're volunteering to be there doesn't mean that the physical and mental wear and tear isn't happening for them as well. And I think that's what that position that we're wanting to create to put into restrictive housing will help combat. We also have reintegration units for those individuals where we actually have step-down programs and units that help people get out of restrictive housing, and we need to do better there as well.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to